When I was younger and on my way home, I always played the same game when I arrived at my apartment building. If I heard a neighbor coming, I'd run to the elevator so I didn't have to say hello and get on. I'd imagine I was being chased by a monster, and I'd get so caught up in the game that my heart would skip a beat. Maybe people thought I was rude, but it made me laugh, and in the end, it wasn't so bad. I'm an adult now, and recently moved to an older building without an elevator. Living on the 7th floor, and finding the climb a bit long, I've brought my game up to date. As soon as I hear other footsteps behind me, in the courtyard of the building, I run to avoid being caught by the monster. Sometimes they're heavy and hurried, other times light and almost silent, but the thrill is always the same. On each floor, I sneak a glance back, checking to see if the monster is still hot on my heels. My heart quickens, and a look appears on my face as I hastily climb the stairs, feeling like a child again. Aside from my childish side, I'm perfectly normal with other humans, and I don't imagine they're werewolves or vampires when I talk to them. Well, only when they annoy me. The other day, as I was waiting for someone downstairs in the courtyard of the building, I saw her pass by for the first time. Tall, rather pretty, and dressed simply but elegantly, she walked past me without saying a word, leaving an absolutely nauseating perfume in the air, as if on top of a flowery smell had been added another smell, that of the sewage you can sometimes smell in town after the rain, but much stronger. The mixture was truly disgusting. I ran into her several times, each time in the courtyard. She often came out of the building's cellar, and always just as smelly. I didn't even know what floor she lived on. Sometimes I wondered what she was doing in that cellar to come out with such a stench. Once, relying on my sense of smell, I knew it was her about to take her turn on the stairs. But forgive me, I had to get away from the monster before it caught up with me. That distinct smell was almost a warning signal. In any case, I don't know what I would have said to her while I was climbing alongside her, as the Stinky barely responded to my cheerful greetings. I ended up talking about it with a neighbor and friend, asking her exactly where this woman lived and what she did for a living. I didn't hesitate to refer to her by the little nickname I'd given her. My friend Vivian replied that she didn't know who the Stinky could be, but after all, she hadn't lived here very long. Case closed then. Until one evening, when I was at the bar with Vivian, she asked me to describe the Stinky to her again, physically and olfactory. She'd been thinking about it again, and she wasn't quite sure what the train of thought was, but it reminded her of a strange story. Her brother, who a few years ago lived in another town, had told her about a similar woman. He had told Vivian that he sometimes came across a woman who was very pretty, but who really didn't smell good. Vivian's brother had a roommate, Simon, who took the piss out of him because he thought this woman didn't exist, that he'd never met her. Simon found this particularly strange because he was on the lookout for any female representative who crossed the threshold of their building, so he couldn't see how he could have missed her for as long as Vivian's brother had been talking about it. Simon, being the skeptic he was, kept his eyes peeled at every opportunity, certain he'd catch a glimpse of this mysterious neighbor. Despite this, she remained invisible to him, which only served to heighten his mockery. Vivian's brother, tired of the taunts, wondered if he would ever convince Simon of the reality of his encounters. In the meantime, he kept to himself the strange paradox of this woman invisible to all but him. Finally, one day, he too ran into her in the courtyard of his building. Then he ran into her a second and final time. Simon was on his way home from a night of drinking, staggering and struggling to keep a clear head. He was climbing the stairs to his 4th-floor apartment as best he could when he heard footsteps behind him. It was the Stinky, although he probably didn't call her that. Ignoring the smell, he stopped and flashed her a charming smile. She then pounced on him, far too quickly for his eyes or brain to have processed the information. Simon felt, despite the anesthesia of alcohol, a sharp pain in his thigh, and when he laid eyes on it, he saw the woman tearing it apart, her unnaturally long and sharp teeth lashing out at flesh, muscle, and even bone. She wasn't eating his leg, just making shreds of it that twirled and landed with timid little noises on the wooden stairs. Just as she was about to attack the other leg, Simon screamed at the top of his voice. A neighbor ran over in panic. The scene had lasted less than a minute. When the neighbor came out, the Stinky had disappeared. Simon lost consciousness and woke up in hospital. Of course, as always in this kind of story, no trace of her existence could be found. Although it was undeniable that something horrible had happened that evening, there was no evidence that anyone was responsible for Simon's condition and the remains of his leg strewn all over the staircase. No trace of DNA or any other evidence. Vivian's brother had confirmed that he'd seen the woman in the building several times, but he was still skeptical that she'd done this to Simon. He was so drunk. How could he trust him? What's more, the shock might have altered his memories, and a few steps away, a dog-fighting ring had been discovered, with many poor, enraged beasts. It didn't explain everything, nor the absence of canine slime found at the scene of the tragedy, but it was at least a slightly more credible explanation. This delirious conundrum hadn't helped Simon to move on, and he'd ended up moving out. Although neither of them ever saw the Stinky again, Simon was constantly anxious about being in that building and resented Vivian's brother for not believing him. Vivian told me that neither she nor her brother could bring themselves to believe Simon's account of events. They supported the idea that he had been delirious with pain, whatever might have caused the accident. I asked her if she thought it could be the same woman, but she laughed and told me not to be afraid. I told her I wasn't afraid, and that I loved horror stories, especially if I could dread that they were true. Vivian decided to go on a pub crawl with some of her friends, whom I didn't know, so I decided to go home. As much as I love horror stories that are a little too true to sleep well, as I ran up the stairs that evening to escape the monster that might be on my tail, my heart was beating even faster than when I played that game as a child. I don't come across the Stinky very often, and maybe it's just a coincidence. But what if one day I don't run fast enough?